Stuart Baillie is partner and head of town planning at Knight Frank, and he led the team that produced the statistics for the NLA's annual Tall Buildings Survey. So perhaps, Stuart, can you outline the results for those who haven't managed to read the report yet? And I'd like to remind people that they can actually download the PDF from our website at NLA.London. So, Stuart, the results.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing this year is another growth in the pipeline for the tall buildings, 20 stories and above category that we monitor through the survey. And this year it's increased to 587 tall buildings in total, which is nearly an 8% increase in the pipeline. And we measure that across the categories of planning applications made, planning permissions, and those buildings under construction. And where we've seen the changes in those categories, the number of planning applications has dropped quite significantly. It's down 27%. However, the number of planning permissions is up 13%, and unsurprisingly, the construction element has been affected most significantly, and that's down 45.5%. I think it's probably just worth touching on that a little bit further. When it comes to planning applications, whilst we acknowledge that there has been quite a significant drop in applications, it's still the third highest year on record for planning applications. So we saw 78 applications in 2020 coming through, and indeed the planning permissions this year or in 2020 have been at the highest level since we've started recording this information for tall buildings. So it feels like the planning system was impacted early on in 2020, but it has rather bounced back. 75% of those planning applications were made in the last 6 months of the year. But it is really on that construction element of the survey where you're seeing the starts were, you know, they were less than half of what we expected in 2020. It's down at the lowest point since 2013. And in terms of tall buildings completions, we were predicting more than 50 completions for 2020 in last year's survey, but actually it's come through at 35. So you know, as expected, the pandemic and the delays that occurred with that have had a big impact on the construction timescales. I think probably also just worth highlighting the point, Peter, that we've seen this continued upward swing in outer London. You know, as it's part of the component of the pipeline, it now stands at 37% of the pipeline overall, with 216 tall buildings in outer London compared with 371 in inner London. You know, that's been powered by the boroughs of Newham, Ealing, Brent, Croydon, Barnet, particularly as the kind of I suppose the leading boroughs for tall buildings. There are still 7 boroughs not on the pipeline currently, although Kingston and Merton are 2 that have had applications in the early few months of 2021. So we'll see a few of those 7 coming onto the pipeline for next year.
Can you talk a bit about the New London plan, which gives boroughs greater powers in determining the location and scale of tall buildings, and also the effect that might have on the delivery of towers in the future?
We've been talking about this issue within Knight Frank's planning team, and we do see it as a significant change in policy in the London plan, and that's been brought about partly by Robert Jenrick's intervention as late as December last year. And really the main change is that this 6-storey threshold, 6 stories or 18 metres, has been set in policy D9 now, and that is the height at which a building will be considered to be tall across London. So all of the boroughs will have to comply with that, and there are a whole host of requirements that boroughs will need to address, or planning officers will need to address in assessing those buildings. We should say, of course, that boroughs have the opportunity to set their own thresholds above 6 stories within particular areas within the borough, or even borough-wide. So 6 stories doesn't feel particularly tall. It's certainly not tall in the context of our 20 stories and above for the survey. So we will see that height threshold being raised in certain areas, but a significant amount of work for the borough to do now through its local plans and its planning policies to actually set the height and location of tall buildings. That's quite a fundamental shift as well, and that has to be based on quite a detailed assessment of character and growth capacity within each borough to determine why a tall building is going to be acceptable, and what sort of form and shape and height that it should be. So that's, again, it's a much earlier stage in the process, and I think we're going to see developers and landowners having to engage much earlier with the planning authority to actually promote their sites in the plan making stage in a much more public forum. So quite a fundamental shift, I think, from what we're used to dealing with, planning applications coming forward generally kind of under wraps in the pre-application process, as developers look to kind of understand the key issues for the local authority and discuss things like viability and quite commercially sensitive conversations. A lot of that is perhaps now going to have to happen earlier in a much more public forum, and where promoters of sites are looking to try and push the height or push the location that's not designated in a plan allocation. We're inevitably good to see more appeals, I think, to determine some of these applications, as councils are likely to feel uncomfortable determining a tall building scheme that doesn't conform with its policies.
Yes, and of course 18 metres is a height which is very much set into the building safety bill legislation in terms of greater constraints on materials and design processes. So that is a further constraint to going over that limit, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, that's part of the two reasons for that 18 metres are government's idea of gentle density, which is a sort of national application, really, but also the fire safety considerations, and for very good reasons, a much more kind of onerous fire safety regime being brought into place, and actually now becoming part of the planning process as well as the building regulations.
The report also suggests that there's still a lot of optimism in the City of London for tall buildings in the eastern cluster. And it looks like a lot of investors are expecting people still to want to go back to the office, at least for part of the week. So are your leasing teams at Knight Frank, are they optimistic that there's going to be more office space coming through?
Yes, I think the activity in the City of London, that sort of eastern quarter, as you like to say, has actually been quite high and quite sustained. What my leasing and office colleagues at Knight Frank are telling me is that we're not in the same situation now as we were in the financial crash of 2008, 2009, when a lot of office development was being built speculatively with no sort of significant pre-lets. I mean, I think it was about 80% of that office floor space was being developed with no end user signed up. That isn't the case now. And it means that the office development that's going up, the high quality grade A office space that's being built now is partly servicing a significant demand and undersupply in that market that has been present since 2008, 2009. And effectively, the sort of speculative element of that is only around 10% in the marketplace. So the demand is there for the grade A office space. The feeling is that most of the occupiers of that space is, they're generally larger businesses that are looking to, they're kind of changing the dial now and trying to encourage people back in. And I think, whilst we'll all be working flexibly, I'm sure going forward, there's still a kind of a view that people need to be back in the office, perhaps more than they're not in the office. But still, a push and a drive for greater sustainability and the ESG agenda, really significant for all these corporate businesses. And also actually the employees themselves wanting better quality space, better daylight and better ventilation in buildings. So I think that's driving the quality element of the market. I think questions probably remain over the older office stock and how much of that is potentially being released back into the market, and I think that's the element to look out for. So the new tall buildings that are coming forward through the pipeline in commercial space, there is the appetite for those. There are the tenants that want to take these buildings. It's possibly that grade B and grade C office space that may be more questionable. Perhaps that comes back into a change of use question again.
But the research also includes quite interesting information from Home Views, which is a sort of trip advisor for residential development. And that comes out with very positive responses from people living in tall buildings, which is different to some of the more, I'd say, critical views of residential tall blocks. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, I think the Home Views piece is a really interesting aspect to the survey this year. We've struggled in previous years. It's always been a question that's been asked about, you know, how do people feel living in these tall buildings? And Home Views have surveyed, you know, thousands of residents across London of tall buildings and lower rise developments as well. And the findings of that have been really fascinating. They've considered that across a number of categories. So they basically asked the residents to rate their experience, their living experience across, you know, the quality of facilities, the design of the property they live in, the location, the value, and management. So there's 5 categories there. And they rank those in a score out of 5. And actually what we've found is that the tall buildings have come in at a better average score than the lower rise generally. And even more interesting is that the tall buildings that feature in clusters rather than an isolated tall building have scored even higher relatively to the other tall buildings. So I think it's been an interesting dynamic, and the survey ranks the top 20 residential buildings within London, which is interesting to look at as well. The kind of features that have influenced that in terms of the sort of commentary that Home Views have gathered, it's that, you know, it's well designed spaces. It's the quality of daylight and the views that they're getting from these taller buildings, and it's the quality of facilities. I should caveat that these buildings are generally more recently developed. They've not gone back to the kind of 1960s and 70s buildings, and so it's probably the more modern elements of the market that they've assessed. But it's still a really quite compelling consideration. I think if there are negatives in this, the negatives have featured more on heating and ventilation, and to a certain extent noise, which is more from sort of opening windows and balconies, and noise from externally from the building. But that is also, these are common complaints for the lower rise buildings as well. So that's not really specific to the tall buildings, but a really interesting piece of the survey this year.
We had a comment yesterday from Colin Wilson, the planner from Old Kent Road, who was saying that some of their towers are actually very popular with their residents, and there are strong communities within them. So lots of different views on that. So Stuart, thank you very much for all the work you've done in putting together this really important research. And we look forward to seeing what happens in the next 12 months.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's going to be a really interesting piece next year as well, as we see what the impacts of 2021, the bounce back effect, hopefully, with 2021, but also I'm sure there'll be some tailwinds there from what we've seen in the last 12 months.
Thank you very much.